Have you ever wondered what hell looks like? For over 5 months in 1942 and 1943, it looked like a city on the Volga River, a city of ghosts and rubble, a city called Stalingrad. More than 1 million people died there. That's more than the combined military losses of the United States and Great Britain in the entire war. The average life expectancy of a new soldier arriving in the city was about 24 hours. Sometimes it was just a few minutes. This wasn't a battle of neat lines on a map. It was a fight for single rooms, for sewer tunnels, for piles of broken bricks. It was a place where history held its breath, and the future of the world was decided street by street. How did a modern army get trapped and destroyed? What does it feel like to fight for a staircase for 2 weeks? And how can human beings endure so much? And what is left of them when it's over? Number 19. Could a single building decide a battle? It was just an apartment block, 4 stories tall. It stood on the edge of a large square called 9th of January Square. Nothing special, but in Stalingrad, location was everything. This building overlooked a key crossroads and gave a clear line of sight to the Volga River, the lifeline for the Soviet 62nd Army. If the German forces took it, they could rain fire down on the Soviet supply ferries. They had to be stopped here. On a late September night in 1942, a reconnaissance squad from the 13th Guards Rifle Division was sent to investigate. It was led by a junior sergeant named Yakov Pavlov. They found the building defended. After a short, brutal fight, Pavlov and his handful of men took it. Inside, in the basement, they found a small group of terrified civilians who had been living there for weeks. Pavlov sent a runner back to headquarters. His message was simple. He had taken the building, he would hold it. And hold it he did. For nearly 2 months, Pavlov's initial squad was reinforced, bringing the total number of defenders to around 25 men. They were not just a platoon, they were a fortress. Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev arrived and took command, though propaganda later focused almost exclusively on Pavlov. The men turned the apartment block into a masterpiece of urban defense. They bricked up the windows, leaving small slits for machine guns. They knocked holes in the interior walls so they could move between rooms without going into the hallways. They dug a communications trench back to their own lines, their only link for food, water, and ammunition. They surrounded the building with barbed wire and anti-personnel mines. On the roof, they placed an anti-tank rifle, a fearsome weapon that could punch through the thin top armor of a tank. The German 6th Army threw everything they had at what they called the Festung, or fortress. Infantry, assaults, tanks, mortars, artillery. Day after day, the attacks came. The defenders of Pavlov's house held on. They became a symbol. For the Soviets, it was a symbol of unbreakable will. General Vasily Choykov, the commander of the 62nd Army, famously noted that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris. This is likely an exaggeration, as historian Antony Beevor points out in his book Stalingrad, but it captures the spirit of the defense. The men inside were a mixed group representing the diverse peoples of the Soviet Union. There were Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, and others. They fought together in the dust and the dark. They rationed their ammunition and their bread. They lived with the civilians in the basement, sharing what little they had. The fight for this one building was a miniature version of the entire battle for Stalingrad. It was close, personal, and unimaginably violent. When the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, finally broke the German lines outside the city in November, the siege of Pavlov's house was lifted. The building was a ruin, but it had never fallen. Yakov Pavlov was made a hero of the Soviet Union. The building itself was one of the first structures to be rebuilt after the war, a monument to the city's defiance. It still stands today, a silent witness. But what do we still not know about this legendary defense? Was the role of Lieutenant Afanasyev deliberately minimized to create a more powerful propaganda story around a common sergeant? How did the handful of civilians in the basement truly survive for 2 months amidst constant shelling and combat? And are there still undiscovered letters or diaries from the 25 defenders that could tell us what it was really like inside that fortress of rubble? Number 18. What if your enemy was just thirst? The battle for Stalingrad wasn't just fought with bullets and shells. It was fought with bread and water. And for a small group of Soviet Marines and soldiers, their main enemy became thirst. Their fortress was not a building, but a massive concrete grain elevator in the southern part of the city. In mid-September 1942, the German army was pushing hard toward the Volga. The grain elevator was a colossal structure, its concrete silos dominating the skyline. It was a strategic prize. From its top, you could see for miles. A small group of defenders, perhaps no more than 50 men from the 92nd Naval Infantry Brigade and the 10th Rifle Division, were ordered to hold it. They were led by a junior lieutenant named Andrei Kozyainov. For about a week, this tiny garrison held off an entire German division. The fighting was some of the most intense in the entire battle. The Germans surrounded the elevator, pounding it with tanks and artillery. The concrete walls were thick, but they began to crumble. Inside, the defenders fought from silo to silo, their world a dark, dusty maze of grain and concrete. The German soldiers who managed to get inside faced a nightmare. A Soviet Marine might be hiding in the grain, invisible until he opened fire. The grain itself was a hazard. It was dry and dusty, and the constant explosions and gunfire ignited it. The whole structure was filled with a choking, black smoke. The grain smoldered and burned, cooking the men alive. A German soldier from the 24th Panzer Division later described it. He said the battle was fought with grenades and bayonets in the dark. He couldn't tell who was friend or foe. The survivors from his unit said they couldn't understand how the Soviets inside were still alive. But the defenders had a bigger problem than the German attacks. They had no water. The water mains were cut. The summer sun beat down on the concrete structure, turning it into an oven. The smoke from the burning grain seared their lungs. Their lips cracked, their throats were raw, they were slowly, agonizingly dying of thirst. The grain they were defending was inedible. It was dry and hard, and eating it only made their thirst worse. Some men, driven mad by dehydration, tried to lick the condensation off cold metal surfaces. Others reportedly drank their own urine. They knew they were doomed. Their radio messages became desperate. They were out of water, they were out of ammunition. They were fighting with their last strength. After about 5 days, the defense collapsed. The few survivors, blackened by smoke and half dead from thirst, were either killed or captured. The Germans had taken the grain elevator. But the stand had cost them dearly. It had tied up a huge number of troops for days, troops who could have been pushing to the Volga elsewhere. The story of the grain elevator is a footnote in many histories, like William Craig's Enemy at the Gates. But it shows the raw nature of the Stalingrad fight. It wasn't about grand strategy, it was about a few dozen men, dying of thirst in a concrete monster, buying time with their lives. But questions remain. How many defenders were actually inside the elevator, and what were their names? The official records are chaotic and incomplete. Did any of them manage to escape through the sewer systems or under the cover of darkness? And what happened to the men who were captured in their final moments? Were their stories ever recorded in German prisoner of war logs that have yet to be fully analyzed? Number 17. How do you fight a war in the dark? When people imagine war, they think of open fields or city streets. They don't think about what's underneath. In Stalingrad, an entire war was fought underground. It was a war in the sewers, in the basements, and in the collapsed cellars of the city. The Germans had a name for it, Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. By October 1942, the city above ground was a wasteland. There was no cover. Moving in the open was suicide. Snipers were everywhere. Mortars and artillery could pinpoint any movement, so both sides went to ground. The city of Stalingrad was built over a network of tunnels, sewer lines, and storm drains. This subterranean world became a second battlefield. Squads of soldiers would navigate these pitch-black tunnels, trying to pop up behind enemy lines. A patrol might enter a sewer manhole in a German-held area and emerge hours later from a drain pipe in a Soviet-held factory courtyard. This was a war of senses. Sight was useless. It was all about sound and touch. A soldier would listen for the scrape of a boot, the clink of a weapon against concrete, the whisper of a foreign language. These fights were sudden and brutal. Two groups would stumble upon each other in a narrow pipe. There was no room to aim a rifle. It was a chaotic mess of pistols, knives, and sharpened trenching tools. Grenades were terrifyingly effective, the blast contained by the concrete walls, turning the tunnel into a meat grinder. The psychological toll was immense. Men spent days in the dark, surrounded by the stench of sewage and death. They had to be wary of booby traps. A tripwire connected to a grenade could be anywhere. The rats, the original inhabitants of this world, were a constant presence, scurrying over bodies and equipment. This underground war was crucial for the Soviets. General Chuikov's 62nd Army was pressed against the Volga, holding a sliver of the city. The sewer system was a vital communication and supply route. Medics used the tunnels to evacuate wounded men. The sappers, the combat engineers, used them to plant explosives under German positions. They would spend days digging a narrow tunnel or sap from a friendly basement towards a German strongpoint. They would pack the end of the tunnel with hundreds of pounds of explosives. Then they would light the fuse and run. The resulting explosion would vaporize the building above, and Soviet shock troops would storm the crater before the dust even settled. This type of warfare is detailed in soldiers' memoirs and after-action reports. It was not glorious. It was dirty, terrifying, and claustrophobic. Men developed a sewer sense, an ability to feel vibrations through the ground, to know when an enemy was digging nearby. Sometimes they would break through into an enemy tunnel, and a desperate close-quarters battle would begin with shovels and pickaxes. The Rattenkrieg was the ultimate expression of the Stalingrad battle. It was fighting reduced to its most primitive form. Man against man, in the dark, with nowhere to run. But the history of this underground war is largely unwritten. How extensive was this network of tunnels, and do maps of these wartime routes still exist in forgotten archives? How many soldiers from both sides simply disappeared into this underworld, their fates unknown, their bodies never recovered? And did the constant claustrophobic stress of the Rattenkrieg lead to a unique form of psychological trauma that was never officially studied or understood? Number 16, could you build a tank and drive it straight into battle? The Northern Factory District of Stalingrad was the industrial heart of the city. It contained three massive plants, the Red October Steelworks, the Barricady Arms Factory, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory. When the German 6th Army reached this district in October 1942, they expected to capture empty shells. They were wrong, the factories were still running. The Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory was particularly famous. Before the war, it built tractors. Now it built the legendary T-34 tank. As the German assault began, the factory became a fortress. The workers, many of them women and young boys, refused to stop production. They worked under constant artillery fire and air raids. The factory's walls were blasted open. The roof was gone in many places. Snow fell on the assembly lines. But they kept working. They knew every tank they built was desperately needed, not in a week, not tomorrow, but right now. The battle for the factory floor was surreal. Soviet soldiers from the 37th Guards Division defended one end of a huge assembly hall while German soldiers occupied the other. A firefight would rage across the workshop, with bullets ricocheting off half-finished tank hulls. Meanwhile, in another part of the factory, under the deafening noise of combat, the workers kept assembling the T-34s. As soon as the tank was finished, it was driven off the assembly line. It often didn't even have paint. Sometimes it didn't have a gun sight. A crew, often composed of factory workers who knew how to drive it, and a handful of soldiers, would jump in. They would load it with whatever ammunition was available and drive it straight out of the factory gates and into the battle raging just yards away. Imagine the scene. A brand new, unpainted T-34, its engine roaring to life for the first time, lurches out of a shattered workshop. Its crew has never fought together before. They drive a few hundred feet and immediately engage a German machine gun nest or an enemy tank. These factory-fresh tanks had a very short lifespan, but they served their purpose. They plugged gaps in the line. They slowed the German advance. They provided a brief, powerful shock to the attacking forces. This incredible story is documented by historians like Stephen Walsh in his book, Stalingrad, the Infernal Cauldron. It was a level of improvisation born of pure desperation. The workers themselves became combatants. When they weren't on the assembly line, they picked up rifles and joined the soldiers defending the factory walls. They formed workers' militias. They knew the factory's layout, its tunnels, its hidden passages. They used this knowledge to ambush German soldiers. The battle for the factory district became a bloody stalemate, a meat grinder that consumed thousands of men on both sides. The Germans captured parts of the factories, but they could never fully clear them. The fight for the tractor factory was a testament to the Soviet concept of total war. There was no distinction between frontline and rear, between soldier and civilian. Everyone fought. Yet many details are lost to history. How many T-34 tanks were actually completed and driven straight into battle during the siege, and what was their average survival time? What were the names of the civilian workers who crewed these tanks, and were any of them ever officially recognized as combatants? And are there any surviving production logs from the factory that could give us a day-by-day account of this desperate race to build weapons in the middle of a firefight? Number 15, what does a city of ghosts sound like? By winter, Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a skeleton, a landscape of ruins under a blanket of snow. And in this dead city, a new kind of hunter emerged, the sniper. The battle for Stalingrad became a sniper's war. It was a personal, patient, and deadly duel fought over hundreds of yards of rubble. The most famous of these hunters was Vasily Zaitsev. Of a shepherd from the Ural Mountains, he had learned to shoot as a boy. His story, immortalized in books and films, began when his commanding officer saw his incredible marksmanship. He was given a scoped Mosin Nagant rifle and a new job hunt Germans. Zaitsev was a master of his craft. He understood camouflage, patience, and deception. He would set up a decoy, a helmet on a stick, and wait for an enemy sniper to reveal their position by shooting at it. He developed a tactic called sixes, where he and a partner would cover a small area from 3 different positions, creating an inescapable field of fire. Zaitsev was not just a soldier, he was a teacher. He trained a whole school of snipers, both men and women, who were nicknamed Zaychata, or Little Hares. His official tally was 225 enemy soldiers and officers killed, including 11 snipers. The real number is likely higher. His fame grew, and he became a hero for the defenders. His exploits were printed in army newspapers. He represented the individual soldier, the clever hunter, outwitting the powerful invading army. As Zaitsev himself wrote in his memoirs, "Notes of a sniper, every German killed with a single bullet saved the lives of his comrades and conserved precious ammunition." The Germans had their own expert snipers. The most famous story, though its historical accuracy is heavily debated by historians like Frank Ellis, is Zaitsev's duel with a German sniper master, identified in some sources as a Major Erwin Koenig. According to the legend, Koenig was sent to Stalingrad specifically to hunt down and kill Zaitsev. For several days, the two masters stalked each other through the ruins of the factory district. It was a battle of wits. Each tried to bait the other into a mistake. Finally, Zaitsev and his spotter tricked Koenig. They used a mitten on a board to simulate a head slowly rising from a trench. Koenig took the shot. The bullet went through the mitten. The German sniper, believing he had killed his rival, briefly exposed himself to check his work. In that split second, Zaitsev fired. The duel was over. Whether the story of Major Koenig is true or a brilliant piece of Soviet propaganda, it captures the essence of the sniper war in Stalingrad. It was a silent, deadly chess game played amidst the chaos. Every broken window, every pile of bricks could hide an enemy. A moment of carelessness meant death. This constant, invisible threat had a huge psychological impact. Soldiers were terrified to move. It paralyzed units and slowed down any advance to a crawl. The snipers of Stalingrad proved that in the right conditions, a single soldier with a rifle could be as effective as a whole platoon. But the story is full of gaps. Was Major Koenig a real person? Or was he a composite of several German snipers, or a complete fabrication to boost morale? How many snipers on both sides operated in the city, and what was their real impact on the battle's outcome? And what happened to the detailed logbooks that snipers like Zaitsev were known to keep, which could contain the untold stories of their silent duels? Number 14, how do you feed a trapped army from the air? In late November 1942, the jaws of the Soviet trap snapped shut. Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement, had encircled the German Sixth Army. Over 250,000 soldiers were trapped in a pocket, or Kessel, around Stalingrad. Their commander, General Friedrich Paulus, knew they could not fight their way out. They were low on food, fuel, and ammunition. Their only hope was the sky. The head of the German Air Force, Hermann Göring, made a fatal promise to his leader. He promised he could supply the entire Sixth Army by air. He said the Luftwaffe could fly in everything they needed. It was a boast, not a realistic assessment. The Sixth Army needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies every single day just to survive and fight. And Göring promised this amount. The reality was a disaster. The airlift began. The workhorse of the fleet was the Junkers Ju-52, a slow 3-engine transport plane. They were easy targets for Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The airfields inside the pocket were constantly shelled. The Russian winter, the infamous General Winter, arrived with a vengeance. Blizzards, ice, and extreme cold grounded the planes for days at a time. The pilots and ground crews were pushed to their limits, working in freezing conditions with little rest. The airlift became a one-way trip for many. Historian Joel S. A. Hayward, in his work Stopped at Stalingrad, details the immense logistical failure. On its best day, the airlift managed to deliver just over 289 tons. Most days it was less than 100 tons. Some days nothing got through at all. For the soldiers trapped in the Kessel, the daily wait for the supply planes was torture. They would stare at the empty gray sky, listening for the drone of engines. When the planes did appear, they were a gift from heaven. But the supplies they dropped were often useless. Crates of cellophane wrappers, bags of pepper, and thousands of right-footed boots were dropped instead of bread, ammunition, or medicine. The distribution was chaotic. Units near the airfields would hoard the supplies, while those on the perimeter got nothing. The failure of the air bridge sealed the Sixth Army's fate. The men began to starve, they ate their horses, then the dogs and cats. Their rations were cut again and again, until a man's daily intake was a single slice of bread made with sawdust. Frostbite and disease spread through the weakened army. The soldiers became walking skeletons, wrapped in rags, their focus narrowed to one single thought food. The promised rescue from the air never came. It was a logistical and strategic blunder of epic proportions, born from arrogance and a disregard for reality. The drone of the Ju-52s became a sound of false hope, a constant reminder of their slow, agonizing doom. But many questions about the airlift persist. To what extent did corruption and disorganization on the German side contribute to the wrong supplies being sent? Are there lost flight manifests that could reveal exactly what was flown in and what was left behind? And what were the personal stories of the Luftwaffe pilots who flew these suicide missions, knowing that most of their comrades would not return? Number 13, can a general's choice condemn an army? He was a professional, an aristocrat, a man of duty. General Friedrich Paulus was the commander of the German Sixth Army. He was the architect of its early victories, and he presided over its complete destruction. His story is one of the great tragedies of the battle. When the Sixth Army was encircled in November 1942, Paulus knew the situation was dire. His staff officers urged him to break out. They still had enough fuel and tanks to make a credible attempt to punch through the Soviet lines and link up with a relief force. It was a risky gamble, but it was their only real chance. Paulus, a cautious and methodical commander, requested permission from his supreme leader to attempt the breakout. The order came back: hold the fortress of Stalingrad, do not retreat, supply will come by air. Paulus obeyed. This was his fatal decision. As Antony Beevor argues in Stalingrad, Paulus was trapped not just by the Red Army, but by his own sense of duty and his deference to authority. He was not a man who disobeyed orders, so he and his army waited. They waited for the air bridge that failed. They waited for a relief army, Operation Winter Storm, which was stopped miles from the city. They waited as their soldiers starved and froze to death in the frozen trenches and cellars. Paulus's headquarters in the final weeks was in the basement of the Unimerg department store in the center of the city. It was a scene of surreal despair. While his men were eating horse meat and fighting off rats, Paulus and his staff tried to maintain the fiction of a functioning command. They had maps, radios, and clerks, but they were commanding a ghost army. The reports coming in were of starvation, typhus, and mass surrender. Paulus saw the suffering. He was racked with dysentery and a nervous tic that made his face twitch. He knew the battle was lost. He knew his men were dying for nothing, but he could not bring himself to defy his orders and surrender. On January 30th, 1943, the anniversary of his leader's rise to power, Paulus received a final radio message. He was promoted to the rank of field marshal. It was a cynical and cruel gesture. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: he was expected to commit suicide. Paulus did not. The next day, January 31st, Soviet soldiers entered the basement of the department store. They found a broken man. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered, the first German officer of his rank ever to do so. His decision to obey orders to the bitter end had condemned nearly 300,000 men. He saved his own life, but at the cost of his army and his honor in the eyes of his superiors. He later became a critic of the government he once served, a lonely and controversial figure, until his death in East Germany in 1957. Yet, his motivations remain a subject of debate. Was his obedience a result of military discipline, fear, or a complete psychological breakdown under the pressure of command? Did he secretly record his thoughts in a diary during those final days in the Unimerg basement, a document that has never been found? And if he had defied orders and attempted a breakout in late November, what were the real chances that the Sixth Army could have escaped the trap? Number 12, how do you lead when your back is to a river? While Paulus was trapped by his own obedience, his opponent was a different kind of man. Lieutenant General Vasily Tykov was the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army. He was tough, ruthless, and absolutely determined. He was given command in September 1942 at the height of the German assault. His orders from Stalin were simple: hold the city or die. Chuikov's motto became, "There is no land for us beyond the Volga." This was not just a slogan, it was a geographical fact. His army was clinging to a few narrow strips of land on the west bank of the river. The Germans were sometimes only a few hundred yards from the water. Retreat was not an option. It was victory or annihilation. Chuikov decided that if he was going to die, he would take the German Sixth Army with him. He set up his command post on the riverbank amidst the constant shelling and bombing. He wanted to be with his men, to feel the pulse of the battle. This was incredibly risky. His headquarters was hit by bombs and shells multiple times. The staff officers were killed around him, but his presence was an inspiration. His soldiers knew their general was sharing the same dangers they were. As described in his own memoirs, the Battle for Stalingrad, Chuikov understood that this was not a traditional battle. This was something new. He called it close quarters combat. His strategy was simple and brutal: hug the enemy. He ordered his soldiers to get as close to the German lines as possible. He wanted them in the next building, the next room, the next trench. This had two benefits. First, it made it difficult for the German Luftwaffe to bomb his positions without hitting their own troops. The dreaded Stuka dive bombers became less effective. Second, it turned the battle into a series of small, vicious fights where the superior training and coordination of the German army counted for less. It became a test of raw courage and stamina, a fight with grenades, submachine guns, and knives. Chuikov pioneered the use of storm groups. These were small, well-armed units of 6 to 8 men, a mix of infantry, sappers, and anti-tank specialists. They were trained to move quickly through the ruins, infiltrating buildings and destroying them from the inside out. They were the masters of the Rattenkrieg. Chuikov was a demanding commander. He was unforgiving of failure or cowardice. He worked his men and his staff to the point of exhaustion, but he also understood them. He knew the value of a hot meal, a bottle of vodka, and a medal for bravery. He was constantly on the radio, talking to his commanders on the front line, encouraging them, cursing them, and pushing them to hold on for just one more day, one more hour. He was the rock on which the German assault broke. His stubborn, ferocious defense bled the Sixth Army white, buying the precious time needed for the Red Army to prepare its massive counterattack, Operation Uranus. He had held the city. But what secrets did Chuikov take to his grave? Are there unreleased operational diaries from the 62nd Army that reveal the true extent of desperation and the controversial orders given during the battle's darkest days? How much did Chuikov rely on NKVD blocking detachments to maintain discipline, a fact often downplayed in official histories? And what was the true unvarnished nature of his relationship with the political commissars who watched his every move? Number 11. Could the dead decide the fate of the living? There is a hill in the center of Stalingrad. Before the war, it offered a peaceful view of the city and the river. Its name was Mamayev Kurgan. During the battle, it became known as the Height of Death. It was Hill 102 on the military maps. Whoever controlled this hill controlled the city. From its summit, artillery spotters could direct fire onto the city center, the factory district, and the vital ferry landings on the Volga. For 140 days, it was the scene of the most relentless and savage fighting of the entire battle. The battle for Mamayev Kurgan began in September 1942. The hill changed hands multiple times. Sometimes the Soviets held the summit while the Germans held the slopes. Sometimes it was the other way around. Often no one held it. It was a no man's land, a churned up moonscape of earth, metal, and human remains. The soil was so saturated with shrapnel and bomb fragments that it was said to contain between 500 and 1,250 pieces of metal per square meter. Even in the winter, the hill remained black, as the snow was constantly melted by explosions. The fighting was continuous. A Soviet division, which would normally have over 10,000 men, would be thrown into the fight for the hill and would be wiped out in a matter of days. General Alexander Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division, famous for its role in the city fighting, bled to death on its slopes. The life of a soldier on Mamayev Kurgan was measured in hours. The noise was constant, a never-ending drumbeat of artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. The ground shook. Men were buried alive in their trenches when a shell hit nearby. The dead were not buried. There was no time. They lay where they fell, frozen in the grotesque postures of violent death. In the spring, when the snow melted, the slopes of the hill were a carpet of corpses. The fighting on the hill was a microcosm of the entire war on the Eastern Front. It was a battle of attrition. It was not about clever tactics, it was about who could absorb the most punishment and who could feed more men into the grinder. The Soviets, with their backs to the river, had to hold it. The Germans, to win the city, had to take it. This simple, terrible equation led to one of the bloodiest patches of ground in human history. The writer Vasily Grossman, a war correspondent who was there, described the hill as a living thing, constantly groaning and shuddering under the endless bombardment. He saw the earth itself as a victim of the war. Today, Mamayev Kurgan is a vast memorial complex. At its summit stands a colossal statue, the motherland calls, a woman with a sword raised, her mouth open in a silent scream. It is a memorial to the victory, but it is also a grave. The hill itself is a mass grave. It is estimated that over 35,000 soldiers who died defending it are buried there. The hill that was once a key to the city is now a monument, a permanent reminder of the price of victory. The dead, in their sheer numbers, had decided the fate of the living, but the full story of the hill is still buried. How many soldiers, from both sides, still lie undiscovered in its soil? Do modern forensic and archaeological techniques hold the key to identifying these lost soldiers and telling their final stories? And what undiscovered battlefield relics, from personal letters to lost regimental banners, are still waiting to be unearthed from the metal-saturated ground of Hill 102? Number 10 were women the secret weapon of the Red Army. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just fought by men. Thousands of women served in the Red Army, playing roles that were unheard of in other armies of the time. They were not just nurses and telephone operators. They were snipers, machine gunners, anti-aircraft gunners, and combat pilots. On the front lines in Stalingrad, women medics crawled through rubble under fire to drag wounded men to safety. They carried not only medical kits, but also pistols and grenades. They were soldiers first, medics second. Dozens of them were awarded the highest honors for their bravery. But perhaps the most famous female combatants were the snipers. The sniper school that Vasily Zaitsev helped run trained many women. They proved to be excellent marksmen, patient and disciplined. Their presence on the battlefield was a shock to the German soldiers, who were not used to facing women in combat. Above the city, another group of remarkable women were fighting. These were the pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later renamed the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Regiment. The Germans called them the Nachtvechsen, the Night Witches. They flew the Polikarpov Po-2, a small, obsolete biplane made of wood and canvas. It was a plane that was never designed for combat. It was slow, flimsy, and had no armor. The cockpit was open to the elements. In the brutal Russian winter, the pilots' faces would freeze. The plane had no radio and no defensive armament except for a pistol. But the Night Witches turned the Po-2's weaknesses into strengths. Its slow speed meant it could fly at treetop level, making it hard for German fighters to intercept. Its engine made a soft, puttering sound. The pilots developed a terrifying tactic. They would fly towards their target, then cut the engine and glide silently over the German lines. The only sound was a faint whistling of the wind through the wing struts. The Germans on the ground would hear this eerie noise just seconds before the bombs hit. Then the pilot would restart the engine and disappear into the darkness. It was a massive psychological weapon. It denied the German soldiers rest, keeping them on edge all night, every night. These women, most of them in their late teens and early 20s, flew thousands of missions over Stalingrad and other fronts. They flew in darkness, in blizzards, with no parachutes. Their leader was Yevdokia Bershanskaya. Many of them, like Lydia Litviak and Yekaterina Budanova, became fighter aces, flying more advanced Yak-1 fighters and shooting down numerous enemy planes over Stalingrad. Their story, documented in books like A Dance with Death by Anne Noggle, is a powerful testament to their skill and courage. They were a vital part of the Soviet war effort, a force that the German army had not anticipated and did not know how to counter. Despite their fame, many aspects of their service remained poorly understood. How were these female combatants treated by their male comrades, and did they face a different set of psychological pressures? Are there personal diaries or letters from the Night Witches that have not yet been translated or published, which could offer a more intimate look at their nightly missions? And why was the combat role of Soviet women so significantly downplayed in post-war histories for many decades? Number 9, what happens to a city without people? The battle was for a city named Stalingrad. But by the time the fighting was over, the city itself was gone. Its people were gone too, either evacuated, trapped, or dead. The story of the civilians of Stalingrad is one of the most tragic and overlooked aspects of the battle. When the German Sixth Army approached the city in August 1942, the local authorities, following Stalin's not one step back order, did not organize a full-scale evacuation. They believed it would cause panic and encourage soldiers to retreat. This decision had horrific consequences. On August 23rd, the German 4th Air Fleet launched a massive air raid. Over 1,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the city. The wooden houses of the suburbs were instantly incinerated. The city's oil storage tanks on the riverbank were hit, sending a sea of burning oil into the Volga. A firestorm engulfed the city. It is estimated that over 40,000 civilians were killed in that first week of bombing alone. The survivors were trapped. The city became the front line. For the hundreds of thousands of civilians still in Stalingrad, life became a subterranean existence. They lived in basements, cellars, and makeshift dugouts. They called their homes foxholes. Food ran out quickly. They foraged for anything they could find, often under sniper fire. They stripped wallpaper from walls and boiled it to make a gluey, tasteless soup. Water had to be fetched from the Volga, a terrifying journey that many did not survive. Children grew up in this world of ruins and death. They learned to distinguish the whistle of different types of shells. They knew how to find shelter in an instant. The writer Vasily Grossman interviewed many of these survivors. He tells the story of a young boy who guided Red Army soldiers through the sewers because he knew the underground network better than anyone. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. They were killed by German bombs and by Soviet artillery. They were sometimes used as human shields. Their suffering was immense and largely ignored by both sides, who were focused entirely on the military struggle. When the battle ended in February 1943 and the Soviets retook the city, they found a wasteland. Of the city's pre-war population of over 450,000, only a few thousand remained. Some accounts say as few as 1,500 civilians were found alive in the central city area. The rest were dead or had been deported by the Germans. The survivors were emaciated, traumatized ghosts. The city of Stalingrad was a vast cemetery. There were no buildings left intact in the city center. There were no trees. There was only rubble, snow, and the frozen bodies of the dead. The task of rebuilding the city and the lives of its people seemed impossible. The civilian story is the least documented part of the battle. How many civilians truly died during the battle? And is it possible to create a more accurate count from local records and eyewitness testimonies? What were the day-to-day survival strategies that allowed a few thousand to endure the entire 5-month ordeal? And what long-term psychological impacts did the siege have on the children who grew up in the ruins, and how did it shape the rest of their lives? Number 8, can propaganda be more powerful than a bullet? The war in Stalingrad was fought not just for territory, but for the minds of the soldiers. It was a relentless psychological war, a battle of propaganda. Both sides used loudspeakers, leaflets, and radio broadcasts to demoralize the enemy. The Germans tried to convince the Soviet soldiers that their cause was hopeless. Loudspeakers set up on the front line would blare messages in Russian. They would promise good treatment and food to any soldier who surrendered. They played tango music and nostalgic Russian folk songs to remind the soldiers of the peaceful life they had lost. They dropped millions of leaflets called propusk or passes. These leaflets guaranteed safe passage to any soldier who came over to the German lines. Some leaflets were sophisticated, trying to exploit political divisions. Others were crude, showing images of happy Soviet prisoners enjoying a meal. The Soviets responded with their own propaganda. They used their loudspeakers to remind the German soldiers of their dire situation. As the Sixth Army became trapped and began to starve, the Soviet messages became brutally effective. They would broadcast the ticking of a clock, followed by a voice saying, "Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia." They would read out letters from captured German soldiers, full of despair and longing for home. They would announce the names of German towns and cities that had been bombed by the Allies. They broadcast news from the other fronts, telling the encircled soldiers that there was no hope of rescue. This psychological warfare was a constant presence. A soldier huddled in a freezing trench would have to listen to these messages for hours on end. For a soldier who was already hungry, cold, and terrified, this constant stream of demoralizing information could be the final straw. As historian Jochen Helbeck explores in his book Stalingrad, the City on Fire, which uses diaries and letters from both sides, the mental battle was as important as the physical one. The propaganda also played a huge role in motivating one's own troops. Soviet newspapers like the Red Army's Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star were filled with stories of heroes like Vasily Zaitsev and the defenders of Pavlov's house. These stories, whether entirely true or embellished, created powerful symbols of resistance and sacrifice. They gave the soldiers something to believe in, a reason to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. The Germans did the same, trying to portray the Sixth Army as martyrs holding out against Asiatic hordes. But as their situation worsened, no amount of propaganda could hide the reality of starvation and defeat. In the end, the most powerful propaganda was the truth, broadcasted by the Soviet loudspeakers to a doomed and freezing army. But the true effectiveness of this war of words is hard to measure. How many soldiers on either side actually surrendered because of a leaflet or a loudspeaker broadcast? Are there classified military intelligence reports that analyze the impact of these psychological operations in real time? And how did the soldiers themselves alter or subvert the official propaganda, creating their own trench rumors and black humor to cope with the reality of their situation? Number 7. What does it mean to freeze to death? The German Sixth Army was prepared to fight a war of movement and firepower. It was not prepared for the Russian winter. When the cold came in November and December of 1942, it became an enemy as deadly as the Red Army. The Germans called it General Winter, and in Stalingrad, it was merciless. Temperatures dropped to -20, -30, and even -40 degrees Celsius. The wind howled across the flat, open steppe, driving the wind chill to unimaginable levels. The German soldiers did not have proper winter clothing. They had been told the campaign would be over before winter set in. They wore their standard wool greatcoats, which were completely inadequate. They stuffed their coats with newspaper and straw for insulation. They wrapped their feet in rags. Many didn't even have gloves. Frostbite became a pandemic. A soldier who took off his boots to check his feet might find he couldn't get them back on because they had swollen so much. Fingers, toes, noses, and ears turned black and died. The sentries were the worst off. A man standing guard for a few hours could literally freeze to death on his feet. The equipment failed too. Oil in the vehicles and guns froze solid. Tank engines wouldn't start. Machine guns jammed. A soldier's rifle might freeze to his mittens. The simple act of reloading a weapon became a clumsy, painful struggle. For the starving men in the Kessel, the cold was a death sentence. Malnutrition meant their bodies couldn't generate enough heat to stay warm. They huddled together in their dugouts and cellars, sharing body heat. Lice, which carried typhus, thrived in these unhygienic, crowded conditions. The book, The Forgotten Soldier, by Guy Sager, a memoir from a German soldier on the Eastern Front, gives a visceral account of what the cold was like. It was a constant, gnawing pain that drained all energy and all hope. Death by freezing was quiet and insidious. A man would simply stop shivering, become drowsy, and drift off to sleep, never to wake up. The Soviets, while also suffering from the cold, were better prepared. They were more accustomed to the climate. They had quilted winter uniforms, felt boots called Valenki, and fur hats. Their equipment was designed to function in extreme cold. The oil they used in their vehicles and weapons was less likely to freeze. This gave them a huge advantage. They could move and fight when the Germans were paralyzed by the cold. The winter did not win the battle for the Soviets, but it was a powerful and cruel ally. It broke the bodies and the spirit of the Sixth Army, turning a military defeat into a human catastrophe. Yet the full biological and psychological impact of the cold is not fully understood. What were the specific medical protocols, if any, that German field doctors developed to treat the thousands of cases of severe frostbite and hypothermia? How did the experience of near-constant, life-threatening cold affect the decision-making and cognitive abilities of the German command? And are there meteorological records from the winter of 1942 to 43 that could be used to create a more precise model of how the weather directly influenced key moments in the battle? At number 6, can a human being forget they are human? As the siege of the Sixth Army wore on into January 1943, the situation inside the Kessel descended into a medieval nightmare. The failure of the airlift meant starvation was universal. The last of the horses had been eaten. Soldiers were hunting for dogs, cats, mice, and crows. They were boiling leather belts and boots to try to get some sustenance. A slice of bread was a priceless treasure. In this final, desperate stage of the battle, the ultimate taboo was broken. Cannibalism began. This is the darkest and most difficult part of the Stalingrad story. It is not something that is widely discussed in official histories, but the evidence is undeniable. It comes from the diaries of German doctors and the reports of Soviet interrogators who questioned the prisoners after the surrender. The book, The Stalingrad Protocols, contains these chilling interrogations. German prisoners, when questioned, spoke of it in hushed, ashamed tones. It was an act of pure, last-ditch survival. It typically happened in the makeshift field hospitals or aid stations, which were filled with the dead and dying. A soldier, maddened by hunger, would secretly cut flesh from a corpse. There were reports of bodies found with parts of them, like the liver or thigh muscles, crudely sliced away. The doctors' diaries described their horror at these discoveries. They tried to stop it, but they were powerless. The bonds of civilization and military discipline had completely dissolved. It was every man for himself. This was not organized or widespread. It was a series of isolated, secret acts of desperation by men who had lost all hope and were driven by the most basic animal instinct to survive. It is a testament to the absolute extremity of the suffering in the Stalingrad pocket. The men were not monsters. They were soldiers who had been pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance. They had been abandoned by their leaders and left to starve and freeze in a frozen hell. The fact that some of them resorted to this shows the complete breakdown of the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. The story of cannibalism at Stalingrad is a reminder that war can strip away everything that we consider to be human. Our morality, our compassion, our dignity. It is the final, horrifying consequence of a battle that had already reached unprecedented levels of brutality. The full extent of this horror remains unknown. How widespread was cannibalism in the final weeks, and was it more common in certain parts of the pocket than others? Did the German command ever issue official orders regarding the treatment of corpses to prevent these acts, and if so, have these orders survived? And what was the long-term psychological impact on the survivors who witnessed or knew about these events? And did they ever speak of it after the war? Number 5, what happens after you surrender? On February 2nd, 1943, the last pocket of German resistance in Stalingrad surrendered. The battle was over. For the German soldiers who had survived the fighting, the starvation, and the cold, a new ordeal was about to begin. The ordeal of captivity. Around 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. They were not an army anymore. They were a column of ghosts. They were emaciated, suffering from frostbite, typhus, and dysentery. Many could barely walk. They were marched out of the ruined city and into prison camps in the surrounding steppe. The march itself killed thousands. Any man who fell out of line was often shot or simply left to die in the snow. The conditions in the hastily prepared Soviet POW camps were abysmal. There was little food, little medicine, and inadequate shelter. The Soviets themselves were short on supplies, and they were not inclined to be generous to the men who had destroyed one of their cities and killed so many of their people. The death rate in the first few months of captivity was catastrophic. The prisoners, already weakened by the siege, died in droves from disease and malnutrition. Of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 to 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The last of them were released in 1955, more than a decade after the war ended. Their story is one of quiet, forgotten suffering. They were sent to labor camps all over the Soviet Union, from the Arctic to Central Asia. They worked in mines, factories, and construction projects, helping to rebuild the country their army had tried to destroy. For many Germans, the fate of the Stalingrad prisoners became a powerful national trauma. For years after the war, families waited for news of their fathers, sons, and brothers, clinging to the faint hope that they were still alive. The story of the Stalingrad prisoners is a stark reminder that for a soldier, the end of a battle is not the end of the war. Surrender is not salvation. It is often just the beginning of a different kind of struggle for survival. The fate of these 91,000 men is a tragic postscript to a battle that had already consumed so many lives. As detailed in historical accounts and memoirs, their long journey through the Soviet camp system was, for most, a slow, anonymous death march. But the full accounting is still incomplete. Do detailed records exist in Russian archives for each of the many POW camps that held the Stalingrad prisoners, which could help trace the final days of many of the missing? How did the experience of captivity differ for officers versus enlisted men, and for different nationalities within the 6th Army, like the Romanians and Italians? And what are the untold stories of the few who managed to escape from the camps and make the impossible journey back to Germany? Number 4, did a trap close the trap? The encirclement of the German 6th Army was a brilliant military operation. It was called Operation Uranus. But it's followed by a smaller, less famous, but equally important operation. It was called Operation Little Saturn. And its purpose was to ensure that the trap of Stalingrad stayed shut. After Operation Uranus succeeded in November 1942, the German High Command frantically tried to organize a relief effort. This effort was led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and was codenamed Operation Winter Storm. A powerful panzer group began to push from the southwest towards Stalingrad, trying to break through the Soviet encirclement and create a corridor to the trapped 6th Army. For a few days in December, it looked like it might succeed. The relief force got to within 30 miles of the pocket. The trapped soldiers could hear the sound of the fighting. Hope surged through the Kessel, but the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, had anticipated this. They launched their own offensive, Operation Little Saturn. This was not a direct attack on the relief force. Instead, it was an attack much further to the west. It was aimed at the Italian 8th Army, which was holding the flank of the German army group. The Italian army was poorly equipped and overstretched. The Soviet attack led by General Nikolai Vatutin shattered the Italian lines. The Italian army collapsed and began a desperate, freezing retreat that became known as the Italian Stalingrad. This collapse far to the west created a new, much bigger threat. It threatened to cut off and encircle Manstein's entire army group, including the relief force itself. Manstein was a brilliant commander, and he saw the danger. He was faced with a terrible choice: continue the push to relieve Stalingrad and risk his own army being encircled, or pull back to save his own forces and abandon the 6th Army to its fate. He chose to pull back. The relief attempt was over. Operation Little Saturn was the final nail in the coffin for the 6th Army. It was a masterful piece of strategic thinking. Instead of fighting a head-on battle with the powerful German relief force, the Soviets hit them where they were weakest, on their flank, hundreds of miles away. It was like a judo throw, using the enemy's own weight and momentum against them. It ensured that no help would ever reach Stalingrad. The story, detailed in military histories like David M. Glantz's Endgame at Stalingrad, shows that the battle was not just won in the rubble of the city, but also in the grand strategic chess match played out across the vast, frozen steppe. But questions about this critical phase remain. How close did Manstein's relief force actually come to succeeding, and was there a single moment or decision that tipped the balance? What was the real extent of the Italian army's collapse, and are there undiscovered Italian war diaries that could provide a new perspective on the chaos of Operation Little Saturn? And to what degree did internal arguments and rivalries within the German High Command hinder the planning and execution of the relief attempt? Number 3, could one man's diary tell the whole story? History is often told from the perspective of generals and grand strategies, but the real story of war is in the experiences of the individual soldier. One of the most powerful accounts of the Battle of Stalingrad comes from the diary of a German lieutenant of the 94th Infantry Division. His name was Wiegand Wüster. His diary, parts of which have been published and analyzed by historians like Johann Helbeck, provides a ground-level view of the descent into hell. In the summer of 1942, Wüster is confident and optimistic. He writes about the beauty of the Ukrainian landscape and the inevitable German victory. He is a professional soldier, proud of his unit and his country. As he gets closer to Stalingrad, his tone begins to change. He is shocked by the ferocity of the Soviet resistance. He describes the brutal street fighting, the constant fear of snipers, the exhaustion. The big picture of the war disappears, his world shrinks to his trench, his handful of men, and the daily struggle for survival. He writes about the lice, the dirt, the lack of clean water. He misses his wife and dreams of a normal life. When the encirclement happens, his diary entries become filled with a growing sense of despair. He writes about the dwindling rations, the bitter cold, the wounded men dying with no medical care. He sees the hope draining from the faces of his soldiers. He describes the failure of the airlift and the fading sounds of the relief attempt. His entries are short, stark, and powerful. No food. Many frozen to death. Is there still a God? His last entry is in January 1943, just before the final surrender. He writes that he has accepted his fate. He is no longer afraid of death. He is only tired. He gives his diary to a wounded comrade who is being flown out on one of the last planes, hoping it will one day reach his wife. Wiegand Wüster was never seen again. He disappeared into the vast anonymity of the Stalingrad prisoners, one of the 91,000 who never came home. His diary is a precious historical document. It is not propaganda, it is the honest, private thoughts of a man watching his world fall apart. It shows how the arrogance and confidence of a victorious army were ground down into dust by the brutal reality of Stalingrad. It reminds us that every soldier in that battle, on both sides, was an individual with a family, with hopes and with fears. Worcester's diary gives a human face to the incomprehensible numbers and statistics of the battle, but his is just one story. How many other diaries and collections of letters from Stalingrad soldiers, both German and Soviet, are still held in private family collections, their contents unknown to historians? Could advanced digital analysis of these personal texts reveal common psychological patterns or previously unknown details about daily life in the battle? And is it possible that somewhere in a Russian archive, a simple prisoner registration card holds the final, unknown fate of Lieutenant Wiegand Wooster? Number 2, was it a turning point for the world? The Battle of Stalingrad ended in a crushing defeat for the German army, but was it truly the turning point of the Second World War? Many historians argue that it was. Before Stalingrad, the German military seemed invincible. They had conquered most of Europe. They had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, to the outskirts of Moscow and the Caucasus oil fields. The momentum of the war was on their side. Stalingrad changed everything. It was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe. An entire army, the Sixth Army, one of their best and most experienced, was completely annihilated. They lost not only the 300,000 men trapped in the pocket, but also vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and equipment. The psychological impact was enormous. For the German people and the army, it was the first time they had suffered a defeat of this magnitude. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. The government officially announced 3 days of national mourning. For the Allies and the occupied peoples of Europe, the news from Stalingrad was a beacon of hope. It proved that the German war machine could be stopped and that it could be beaten. Militarily, the loss of the Sixth Army and its allied Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies created a huge gap in the southern part of the Eastern Front. The Soviets were able to launch a series of offensives, retaking vast amounts of territory. From Stalingrad on, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed to the Red Army. They were now the ones attacking, and the Germans were the ones retreating. This began the long, bloody road to Berlin. As historian Jeffrey Jukes writes in Stalingrad, The Turning Point, the battle drained Germany of manpower and resources that it could never replace, especially experienced officers and NCOs. The war would last for another 2 years, but many argue that the final outcome was decided in the ruins of the city on the Volga. It forced the German high command to strip divisions from other fronts, including Western Europe, to stabilize the East, which in turn aided the future D-Day landings. Other historians argue for different turning points, such as the Battle of Moscow in 1941 or the Battle of Kursk in 1943. Some point to the entry of the United States into the war as the decisive moment, but Stalingrad holds a unique place. It was a battle of such epic scale and symbolic power that its impact resonated around the world. It was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. But the debate continues. If the Sixth Army had been allowed to break out, how might it have changed the course of the war on the Eastern Front in 1943? To what extent was the victory at Stalingrad a result of Soviet skill versus German blunders? And how does this affect its status as a definitive turning point? And if Stalingrad had fallen, could the German army have realistically achieved its goal of capturing the Caucasus oil fields, and how would that have altered the global balance of power? Number 1, why do we still tell these stories? The battle is long over. The city, now called Volgograd, has been rebuilt. The ruins have been cleared, and monuments have been raised. But the stories of Stalingrad endure. Why? Because they tell us something fundamental about the human condition. They show us the absolute worst of what people can do to each other, the calculated cruelty, the industrial-scale slaughter, the descent into barbarism. But they also show us the best. They show us the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the courage of a soldier defending a single room, the determination of a worker building a tank under shell fire, the sacrifice of a medic crawling into the line of fire, the stubbornness of a general with his back to a river. The stories of Stalingrad show us that even in the deepest, darkest hell, it is possible to find examples of loyalty, bravery, and an unbreakable will to survive. They are a warning about the dangers of arrogance, of hubris, of ideologies that devalue human life. The Sixth Army marched into Stalingrad believing in their own superiority and their manifest destiny. They were consumed by a city that refused to die. The battle teaches us that war is not a glorious adventure. It is a meat grinder, it is filth, lice, starvation, and fear. It is the smell of death and the constant deafening noise of destruction. We tell these stories to remember the more than 1 million people who died there. Soldiers and civilians, Germans and Soviets, men and women, each one of them was a person with a life, a family, a future that was stolen from them in the rubble of that city. To forget them is to allow their sacrifice to become meaningless. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point not just in a war, but in human history. It was a crucible that tested the limits of what a city, an army, and a people could endure. And the echoes of that test still resonate today, reminding us of the terrible price of war and the enduring power of the human will to resist. But perhaps the most important question is the one we must ask ourselves. Have we truly learned the lessons of Stalingrad, or are we destined to forget them? What undiscovered personal accounts still lie hidden, and could they fundamentally change our understanding of the motivations of the ordinary soldiers who fought there? And in an age of new conflicts, what is the most vital lesson from the rubble of that city on the Volga that we must carry into the future?